If you've ever made a short film before, you'll know it can be a lot of fun. But once you finish filming, all of that was just the beginning. The real story and the real challenge is bringing it all together in the edit. And today, I'm pulling back the curtain on my entire process for bringing together the editing on my latest film, The Throne. If you haven't seen the film, it is posted on my main channel, linked in the cards above. This video is also the counterpart to a behind-the-scenes video I made of the production, also on my main channel. So if you're looking to learn more about the actual production of the film, that's where you'll find it. If you want to see a simple before and after breakdown of my editing timeline, I'm posting it here on this channel as a YouTube short, for the sake of keeping things organized. I'll be covering a lot of different areas in this video, so if you're looking for a specific section, chapters are linked below for your convenience. If you've ever sat down to edit a short film, you'll know it's a challenging process. From sorting footage to building assemblies, then revising again, and then perhaps revising once more, then having to figure out color, VFX delivery. It can be very overwhelming. And my goal today is to provide you with some insight as to how you can manage each step of the post-production process. So to give an outline, I've gone ahead and broken down my process into the following sections. First, I'll ingest and sort, then I'll assemble the scene, then I'll assemble the story from the scenes, then I do sound design, after that comes VFX and titles, after that comes color, and then finally, I deliver. I find that having this streamlined process really helps to edit a film efficiently and quickly. Even if it serves as a rough outline, it still is much more helpful than having nothing at all. A lot of these areas could be their own videos in their own right, so my goal for this is to provide more of an overview of each one and show how it looks in my workflow. Now with that out of the way, let's dive into the first step, ingesting and sorting footage. All right, so we are here in DaVinci Resolve now, and I have a few different areas I want to cover as we just went over, but the first is going to be ingesting and sorting. So ingesting and sorting is the foundation of the work that I do when it comes to editing. And again, this isn't exactly how you have to do it, but hopefully what I'm showcasing here can give you some insight as to what could work for you. So this is a very basic media bin structure. I have my video, audio, and then I have timelines, and I sort by number, because that way, 01, video is always going to be on the top, then you have audio, and then timelines, I always have at the bottom, so I do that by doing ZZ, that way it just gets sorted to the bottom, can find it easily. It's great, because no matter how many source folders you have, it's always going to be at the bottom. So that's my workflow for that, and then within each one, I have organization by scenes for video, and then I've made sub bins for scene 1, scene 2, and scene 3. And if you go into these bins, you'll see I have all the clips from each scene, and then any renders of those, like if I do render in place or stuff like that, or compound clips, those go into here as well. And yeah, same thing for every single scene. Now, technically there are 5 scenes in this film. I didn't have a script. I made the film as I went along, which is something I talk about in the overview video. It wasn't really scripted as much as it was more of a let's go and figure out what we get, which, you know, can work pretty well in filmmaking sometimes, but this was more of a we have no idea what to expect. We have a general picture of what we want, so we'll go out and we'll film that. And I know there's going to be 3 general scenes, but technically scene 3 is, you know, scene 3, 4, and 5 all in one, because there's 3 major locations in that. And so that's how I kind of would actually classify a scene looking backwards in retrospect of what that was. But here we go. It's organized into scenes. You get the point. If you're doing a short film, that's very helpful to have it organized by scene. And longtime and experienced users of DaVinci Resolve will say, oh, you don't even have to do it with your bins. You could just import your shoot day folders. So if you've organized your initial file structure by shoot day, you can just import those and then use smart bins. Just something I've used before, and I would like to do a video on that eventually. I didn't do it for this project just for the sake of time. It is more helpful if you're working on a larger project to have smart bins and to use keywords, because smart bins in a short summary, you can type in metadata for your clips or use metadata that's already there if the cameras have recorded it. And you can sort based on that metadata. So, shoot day, scene, camera, lens, stuff like that. You can sort by all that. So for a large project like a documentary, that's going to be very helpful, especially if you have a lot of different subjects and a lot of different things going on. Very helpful to do that. But this 3-minute short film shot in 2 days, edited within the span of about a week if you combine all the days. So very simple, and I just wanted to have a simple file structure since it was just me doing it. I knew where everything was. So if you're looking for something simple, just sorting by bins and doing by scene, or if you're doing a documentary, by location or something like that, very helpful. So you'll have video, and then I had a folder for VFX because I did some depth maps and I did some compositing, which we'll get into later in the VFX section of this video. And then I also have some BTS stuff because I did a whole before and after timeline, which I posted as a YouTube short on this channel. I did that in the same project, so that's also in here. But outside of video, we have audio. So if you go to the audio, I've sorted by music and then sound effects. Music, obviously I've put in the names of the songs and I've put each song in there. And the reason each song has its own subfolder is because I use Epidemic Sound for my videos. And technically with Epidemic Sound, you can choose to download stems. And if you download all the stems and it's just one huge bin with all your music and all the different stems, it can be hard to find the music. So that's why I do it per song, and then I do that. I don't actually think I downloaded any of the stems, actually, except for that one. That one has the stems, the rest of them don't, so or maybe that one. So sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't. I just prefer to have it a little bit more organized that way, organized by the name. And then I have sound effects, which is that. There's quite a few sound effects in this, which that's another section of this video I want to talk about. But yeah, that's a basic look at organization for just media files. And then there's timelines, which I manage in the timelines bin. And I have, like I said, I did the BTS stuff in this project. So that's what that's for. Then I have cuts, and I pulled some stills. And for like sending quick stills to myself, I like to do it in 1080p. That's why I don't always grab them just from the timeline. I'll sometimes copy the timeline and lower the resolution so I can export a still that's a lower file size. And I make thumbnails in DaVinci Resolve, so I made a timeline for the thumbnails. That's a whole other video idea. Yada, yada, yada. Just, having organization for where everything goes is very helpful. But getting to part of my file organization is going to be how I organize my cuts. So I didn't do a ton of different cuts, and I honestly was able to get the story cut of this film done very quickly, but this kind of leans into what I'm talking about next. You can have a place for your timelines to exist, but you also want to make sure that you're archiving your timelines, especially if you're working on a project over multiple days. You can only undo so many times in DaVinci Resolve. So you'll see here, there's scene 1 assembly prior to 9:05:25, 11:50 p.m. That was just something I put in there as an example. So I duplicate the timeline and I rename it to the exact time that I duplicated it. That way I know, oh, okay, I went and I made these changes, but it's too far for me to go back and undo. I didn't like what I did, but I can revert back to what I had. So if you do that at the start of every day or at the start of every hour, depends on how intense you want to be about it, it can really, really help you with your films. So I did the same thing for scene 2 and yada, yada, yada. I did edit this pretty quickly. There weren't a ton of major changes being made after I had the initial story cut locked. But yes, I want to talk about that next, and that is scene assembly. So right here we have the full timeline, which we can dive into a little bit more in a bit. But before I arrived at this point where I had the whole timeline, I did scene-based assembly, mostly. Scene 1 is 5 clips, 6 clips. So very, very simple, but really what I did is, day 1 we filmed scene 1. I took all the clips from scene 1 and I laid it out. This is the story. Figure out which angles I want to use, which are the best takes, and I laid that out into a very quick, rough assembly. And that's the baseline, and then you can go and you can build on it from there. So if I go and look at scene 2 assembly has a little bit more. We have the garage door opening, we've got some sound effects in there, and I did put music in to start kind of sorting it through. And then I went and added scene 3, So that's the rest of the thing going up the mountain. That scene is combined, and then I went ahead and combined that with scene 1 to create a full assembly. Now, I didn't do the greatest job of showcasing that because technically you want to build an assembly for each scene, and scenes 2 and 3 kind of got blended together. And as I mentioned earlier, scene 3 is technically multiple scenes, but because I didn't have a script, it just wasn't as well organized when I was shooting. That's another thing you want to consider, how organized are you going to be beforehand, or are you just going to figure it all out in post? I knew what I was doing, but if you're working with multiple people, you're doing a larger project, let's say you're handing off to an editor, you want to be able to set it up for your editor to understand what you're giving them. But for me, I knew what I was doing. I knew what I wanted, so I was able to accomplish that. I highly recommend doing your scene-based assemblies first. That way you're working on a smaller plane, and then you can combine your scenes later to create a full timeline. Then that's when you can do transitions and sound effects and adding music and stuff like that to tie it all in together, because you don't just go from scene to scene. There's usually music that carries over, or if it's like a crossfade, there's a pause between scenes, yes, but sometimes scenes are linear and like immediate, and that's what it is in this film. So yeah, just have that in mind, because I find this, at least for me, if you go and you start working on a huge timeline and you're like, oh, where's scene 1? Oh, it's over here. Or scene 7 out of 23, I have 23 scenes. Oh, good grief, I can't find it. It's hard. And if you have a scene-based timeline, you can find the timeline, and then you can go and tweak it there. And then once all your timelines are locked and you have final picture for the timelines, you can combine, then you can start tying everything together. So it starts small, and then you can broaden your approach. That would be my recommendation. So that is scene assembly. And then after scene assembly comes story assembly. And like I was just saying, story assembly is when you take all of your scenes and you put them together and you start tying the pieces together. So on this timeline, I've actually gone ahead and added markers so you can see where the scenes are. Like I said earlier, there was 3 scenes when I was organizing, but looking back in retrospect, there were actually 5 scenes. So scene 1 is the porch, where Ian, the character, looks up at the mountains and ponders going up there with his rocking chair. And then we have scene 2, which is loading the rocking chair into the truck. And then you have scene 3, which is the dramatic exit, heading out of the driveway. And you have scene 4, which is the actual journey up the mountain. And then we finally end with scene 5, which is where he arrives at the overlook and watches the sunset. Now, all of these scenes, they have their individual narrative, like there's the individual like motive for each scene, but they come together for the larger picture. That's why films have a overarching story. It's different than a montage. So the way you're going to edit a short film is going to be a lot different from the way you'll edit a montage. The way that I like to tie scenes together is with 1, music, and then 2, sound design, which we're going to talk about later. But music here plays a huge role, so I'm just going to solo them, and we can take a listen and see how the music can really tie in scene 1 to scene 2. Because we have a different song from scene 1 and a totally different song for scene 2. Individual songs, completely different genres of song, but there's a way that you can tie it in. And then when we get to sound design later, I can kind of finish showing you how they tie together. But the music is the base for that. So let's go to this point where we've got that music starting to come in. It kind of rises up. There's him pondering. Begins to fade out. So the music can help with your pacing. Like I just said, we're going to tie together the music and make it blend more with sound design, which we'll get to in a second. But your music can really establish your pacing. This whole intro sequence, there's a build-up, and then there's just this tension, like, oh, what am I going to do? What is he going to do? And then you cut to the next scene and you see what he's doing, and the gears completely change up, and you're like, oh, this is going to be fun. And that's where you have like the rock music coming in while he's loading up the truck. So yeah, that's one example of how I merge and intertwine the story as I assemble it. So That's the goal of story assembly. You're getting to a point where your story is basically done. You have everything in place and you're just weaving the pieces together, making it flow. Story assembly. And after story assembly, I like to do sound design. And sound design is really going to tie in the music we just looked at with the full narrative. So we have this music, but it feels like there's a little bit missing. And this is the huge thing with sound design that a lot of people, in my opinion, overlook. Sound is half of your film, and music is technically sound, but there needs to be more than just music, because if you take away the music, then there's, maybe you'll have dialogue, but you want the full picture. You want the audience to be immersed in the film. So you can use sound to drive the story, and that's what I wanted to do here. So we're going to take a look at the sound effects for this transition between scene 1 to scene 2. Some of my favorite ones that I used, you can say I did a gunshot in reverse to rise up, and then I did another riser, a violin riser, and then a sunrise riser. I don't know what that means, but it sounded cool. And so I'll put those in with the soloed tracks. We'll get those all lined up and we can give it a listen, and you can kind of see how that sounds now that we have added in sound design on top of the music. So that is just a glimpse at all the sound design is doing there. And that's actually not all the sound design. That's only 3 out of 27 tracks, I think, that are in use. Not at that particular moment, but I have quite a lot of sound effects on this timeline. The main thing you're going to see is along this timeline, there are purple sound effects and then there's green ones. Green sound effects in this timeline, the way I've organized it, those are from clips that I actually recorded. And then the purple, that's everything that's added later. So if we go and we look at this timeline, you'll see there's a lot of purple. And then down there, there's some more green. That's a different color green. That was audio that my friend Ian recorded of his truck after the fact and sent to me because we didn't remember to do that while we were there. That is the build out of sound design. And you'll see that about 70–80% of it is added later, which that comes down to the philosophy of how you're planning to record sound on set. So are you going to have a sound mixer? Or are you going to just do it later because it's more of a solo film like this? But there's 2 types of sound effects. There's sound effects that exist within the context of the scene, like we have the garage door here opening, that's added in. But then you'll also have sounds like the gunshot in reverse and the riser, and those are not sound effects that existed in the scene. So I believe the term for this is diegetic or non-diegetic. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but the diegetic sounds are existing in the context of the film, like in the world of the film. The non-diegetic sound effects are sounds that do not exist in the world of the film, but exist for the purpose of advancing the story or advancing the narrative. So that's what you have with the violin riser and the gunshot, and then you have the real sound effects, but they all tie in. So you'll see that these waveforms kind of all get to this point where they converge right here around this mark. The peak of the audio is going to be right when the music starts and when the garage door starts opening. So I've lined it all up in such a way that it builds up to that moment, and then you're automatically immersed into the next scene. Because technically, if we just solo this track and there is no sound, it goes from a relatively bright scene to a dark scene with no detail. You need something to tie it in, unless you're intentionally trying to do that for the sake of your story. In order to make that transition less jarring, sound design really comes in handy. And one of my other favorite sections of this film, I'll show you briefly, is the scene where Ian tears out the truck, and a lot of the sound is added. Especially, you'll notice this bit right here. There's a bunch of different sounds kind of layered and mixed on top of each other to create that just raw feeling of power from the truck and all that kind of stuff. So let's just give that a listen. I'm going to mute the music so that you can just hear the sound effects, and we'll add the music back in and listen again. So there's quite a lot of things going on in that. We have the sound that was actually recorded of the truck moving along when we were actually filming. And then we have added sounds of an old pickup truck passing by, car whooshing by. We've got, I think in here I have dirt kicking up because of when he goes past. I'll show you that. That was one of my favorite sound effects I found. I'm like, oh, that's perfect, because as he drove past, he kicked up so much dust. It was perfect to kind of have that in there. It kind of just adds to the grittiness of it. And then you have a lot of, there's risers and then a ton of cool effects for the gear change. Because the gear change does not normally sound like that, especially not in an old Ford, but it's augmenting it for the sake of the story. So if you take all of that and you add it in with the music, you get this. So there's a lot more power to the scene now because you have the music, the visuals, and the sound design all tied together. And the music is really cool on its own, but if I were to just solo the music here and play it back as it was, you'll see that it just does not have the same power. It's like half the film is missing. It's not fully there. So sound design can really take your films to the next level. Even if you're just adding a few effects, you don't need to have 35 audio tracks necessarily per se, but just a few effects here and there can really, really help with the production quality of your films. So you can never do too much sound design. You can only do too little. So highly recommend investing time into putting sound design into your film. And again, if you want to see a dedicated video on one of the topics I'm talking about, I would love to do something like that on sound design. So just let me know in the comments, because there's so much more I could dive into, and I could make a whole scripted video for it. This is more of just there's so many things I want to say, but for the sake of time, I'm going to move on, just because I could just keep talking for hours and hours, and I did. This is my second time recording this. So next, after sound design, comes VFX and titles. And this film had surprisingly more VFX than I was planning, at least in the final cut. The first major VFX that you'll see here is going to be the lens blur in the background, because I shot this on my phone. That's not something you normally get. I wanted to distract as much as possible from the fact that it was shot on the phone. I didn't want people to think that. Surprisingly, the iPhone 16 Pro with 10-bit color, you can do a lot, and we'll dive into the aspect of doing color for this in a bit. If you look at the original shot, this is a rendered version, because depth map and Magic Mask is very light. It played back real time. If we look at the original version of the shot, if it would load, there is no depth of field at all. And then you go and you play it back here, and it's a totally different world. Totally different world. I am very impressed with how it turned out. This is literally me using the Magic Mask tool and then blurring out the background with the lens blur tool, adding in anamorphism to the lens blur. And it does so much for the film. And combine that with the color grade that we'll talk about in a minute, and you just get this beautiful, beautiful result. So that's the first major visual effect here in the film. The next one that I did was a lightning strike. And there was a real storm while we were up on the mountain, but I didn't actually capture any lightning striking, and I wanted to, just it didn't happen. So I had to fake it in post. for the sake of the story, of course. I didn't have the power to summon lightning at will, as cool as that would be, but this is the effect. So if we look at the actual frame here, it's literally just a frame of lightning, luma keyed and then put over with a flash effect, like a flickering effect. And then I masked out the mountain so I could have it light up the clouds a little bit more, and I did local masking on that. That's all done in Fusion, so I'll show you the node tree for that briefly. It was a long time ago when I actually did this. This is a mess, but there was, you know, masking out the mountain, masking out some of the clouds, and then luma keying, all that kind of stuff. It was way more complicated than it actually needed to be, because I was trying to have it be a more intense lightning strike that interacted with the actual footage a lot more, but I just didn't have the time to do that. So if you look at it closely, it's a little cheap because you don't, it's covered up by the flash that I put over it, but I still think it serves its purpose for the actual film. So that's one of the fun little effects I put in there. And then the next effect was probably the more intense one, and that was the lens flare replacement. You'll see it's a not bad clip. It's pretty stable, but because of the way the stabilization on the iPhone works, the camera is actually, you know, shaking a little bit and moving. The image is stabilized, but the lens flare obviously doesn't get stabilized. The lens flare is going to react to the actual motion of the camera, and that's what you have here. So if we look closely at this in full screen, you'll see this lens flare is just over here bouncing around. And I went through and frame by frame removed the lens flare and added in a new one, so we get this result. And I'll show you in full screen so you can see a little bit better. It took probably about an hour or so to do that for this shot, because I had never really done that before. It didn't take horribly long to do. It was just more so tedious, because you're basically going in frame by frame and painting out the lens flare, and then moving to the next frame, painting it out again, and again. For this is a, how long? This is a 3-second clip. Probably took me about half an hour to 45 minutes just to remove the lens flare. And I think it looks good. You can't really tell that it's gone. At least I can't. If you look closely, you probably can. I put this out on YouTube. People are not going and pixel peeping on YouTube usually. The compression will get you before you notice the clone stamping from the removal of the lens flare. But this is the default lens flare effects in DaVinci Resolve. This is not a plugin or anything I'm using. I just went into the color tab and I added the lens flare effect, and I went and I customized it a little bit to add that anamorphism and, you know, golden look to it. And I think it looks really good. And I did it for the whole scene, so we have it for that. We have it kind of on this one, a little bit there, and then again on that wide shot, and then this one too. And you can track lens flares in. Again, could be its own video. There's a lot to dive into here, but it really leveled up the production, because without that lens flare, you know, it's not a horrible shot, but the iPhone just has this weird, you know, flaring to it that just doesn't look great on its own. But if you go and you augment that with an anamorphic style lens flare, it hides a little bit of the fact that it was done on an iPhone, and really helps to make the shot look more beautiful. And yeah, so those are the effects. And at the same time that I do effects, I usually do titles, which you have here. These are actually titles from Motion VFX, from their M-Title cinematic pack. I did a review on them a long time ago. They sent them to me, the review. Actually, it was a review of their wedding pack, but they gave me access to a few other ones as well. I really like them. I could have made my own titles for this, but it was easier just to slap these on, and I think it worked pretty good. And yeah, nice, simple effects, nothing too crazy there. But yeah, that's my VFX and titles workflow. General overview, because there's so much I could dive into. So if you want more in-depth videos on some of the things I talked about, please let me know, and I would love to go ahead and I'll write a script and I'll make that into a video. But hopefully that gives you some insight into what happened in the process of bringing this film to life. The last major thing we have to talk about is going to be color. And color is probably one of the things I'm most proud about and was most surprised about too with this film. because again, it's shot on an iPhone. You don't usually expect much out of a phone camera, but now that the iPhone can shoot 10-bit log, you can do quite a lot. And you've been seeing a little bit of it here and there. My workflow for color in this film was a little bit unique. I tried experimenting with a few things because I really wanted to test the potential of the iPhone, particularly in dynamic range and how much shadow and highlight retention it had. I was able to do quite a lot. My actual workflow here is group-based. So if you've been using DaVinci Resolve for a long time, you'll probably know what that means. If you're new to DaVinci Resolve, you normally think, oh, color, you just go and you make a few nodes and you do your grade. And if you've used DaVinci long enough to know what color space transforms are, you'll see that I don't have any on here. And you'll be like, whoa, where are your color space transforms at? And they're there technically, but this is group organization. So what you do for group organization, and this is really helpful if you're working with a larger film or a documentary or something like that, is you take all your clips and you put them into groups. I like to do it on a per camera basis. Obviously this film was done entirely on the iPhone, so it's all one group, but it simplifies your grading because you're creating a sandwich, essentially. Groups function like this. You have your group pre-clip, which is where I have my input device transform to DaVinci Wide Gamut. I'm not actually using a color space transform for this. I'm using CineMatch by Film Convert, which is a software that allows you to camera match any two cameras to each other. In this instance, I'm camera matching the iPhone 16 Pro to the ARRI Alexa 35, and then sending it through an output to DaVinci Wide Gamut, which is my working color space. And the working color space is where the clip function is. So my clip specific grade is here, but that node prior in the group pre-clip is applied to all of the clips in the node. So I only have to do a color space transform and input device transform technically once. And now I have this fixed node tree that you'll see on every single shot. And there are certain things I use on some shots and not on others. For example, I have noise reduction, sharpness, motion blur. I'm using some sharpening, not using any noise reduction. Those are in parallel nodes, so they kind of take the average of each other. Then I'll have depth map, magic mask, and then I was also trying out a new plugin that I got recently called Nano. I didn't really use it a lot in this film because it's a plugin that adds like haze to your videos, and there wasn't really a lot of use cases for that here, but it's definitely something I want to explore further because it has some pretty cool applications, so I want to test it further before I make a video on it. So yeah, those are things that are going to be embedded into the video. I've also gone ahead and added in some lens blur, which if you look here on the corner, the lens blur just adds a little bit of character and softening to the corners. And it's not even just a lens blur, it's a tilt shift blur effect. And if I show you the depth map preview, it's only focusing on the middle, and then there's a major fall off towards the side. So you start here in the middle, it's sharp, and then you go off to the corners and it starts to get softer. And you can really see that in the corners. And I've gone ahead and I've turned the anamorphism all the way down to create that more oval shaped bokeh. Just kind of takes off the digital edge and adds a little bit of character to it. And I wanted that at the beginning of the node tree because it's an embedded effect. So I wanted it to act as if it was part of the footage before I do any additional adjustments. So we have that. Then we'll have the exposure node, which is where I go and I fix exposure, which wasn't done for this shot because it was exposed perfectly. Balance, I didn't do any balance adjustments on this one because it was balanced perfectly. And then there's a curve. I do have a curve, and that kind of, gets me to that film tonality where you get a little bit of a lifted blacks and the whites are brought down a little bit. Then I have power windows. I'm not sure if I'm actually using any in this one, but I have a fixed node tree. So even if I'm not using something, it's still there because you can ripple node changes to multiple clips. Whole other video idea, but there are very, very good reasons to have fixed node trees. Then I have my creative adjustments, and then finally I have my texture. So for this, you have some film grain. I have glow, which kind of helps bloom out the shot. And I think there's actually a color filter on the glow, so it gets a little bit warmer in the highlights. Then I've done bloom, which is just me turning down the midtone detail a lot to take away that digital sharpening. And then I've added some halation, very, very subtle. This is a custom DaVinci Wide Gamut halation that I use. And it's very, very subtle because I don't like the default halation in Resolve. It's too strong and it's not great. You can build it yourself and it'll be better. So yeah, that's the clip-based grade. but the core of the look is actually being done on the timeline filter, which I don't recommend. I was trying it out for this project, and I learned something about the timeline filter that I don't like. I wish I could have done differently. The timeline filter is where I put my output device transform or display rendering transform, DRT. That's sending the image to Rec 709. But before that, I have the master look for all of the clips, which is my Kodak 2383 film print lookup table for DaVinci wide gamut that I use. And that gives that film tonality. This is what they use for big movies. When they print them onto film, they either print it onto one of two stocks, 2383 being one of them by Kodak, and then there's also Fujifilm 3513. This is more of the warmer golden look. Fujifilm 3513 is a wider range of colors. I mean, you get a little bit more green in the shadows. I think stuff like the Matrix, but 2383 is more of like the Interstellar, just that warmer look. It's the movie look. When all the people on YouTube say this is the cinematic look, they're usually talking about Kodak 2383. It looks great. I like it. For Colorado, the tonality and the color works great for it. Oops, I'm on the timeline filter. That's one thing I don't like. The timeline filter, it's your whole timeline. I scroll a little bit, I think I'm on a clip filter, and it sends me to the end of the timeline, whatever. The main reason I would not advise using the timeline filter is because the timeline filter gets applied to everything, not just the clips that are in your group. It's everything. What I should have used instead was group post clip, which is a per group output. So you have your group pre-clip, which is applied to all of the clips in your group, and then you have your group post clip, which is applied to all the clips in your group. The timeline filter is applied to your entire timeline. And I thought, oh, well, if I could try this out, maybe it'll work. You know, if I had multiple cameras, then I don't have to do a group post clip for every single camera. Great in theory, but I found out that the timeline filter gets applied to everything, including titles and effects and like transitions and stuff like that, things that are not color managed. So my titles technically shouldn't look the way they look. The titles have been run through the timeline filter. So this is way more gold than it actually is supposed to be, but I liked it, so I just kept it. But I'm not going to be using the timeline filter anymore going forward. I'm going to be using the group post clip, so it's only being applied to the groups and not the entire timeline. So don't use the timeline filter. You can still do a group post clip. That's how I recommend it. But yeah, don't make that mistake. Big mistake. But it wasn't that big of a mistake because this is a small project and it affected 2 titles. So not the end of the world, but definitely not something to replicate if you're doing a project with a lot of clips that are not going to be group managed. So yeah, that's the timeline as far as color goes. It's really impressive what I was able to do with the iPhone. Like, I'm genuinely surprised at how much detail I was able to pull out and how different it looks from straight out of the iPhone camera. Because if you use the iPhone's, you know, Apple camera app, it's so over sharpened. But the second you turn on Apple Log, all of that sharpness and like yucky stuff they put on the footage just goes away, and it looks super, super natural and organic, and you get the control you want to do whatever you want with it. And I think that's really, really awesome. The iPhone is super nice to have on hand. The only thing is, you know, recording with the Blackmagic camera app, even in the H.264, H.265 mode, is massive, massive files. But it looked beautiful for this film. Combining it with an ND filter for some nice motion blur was just spectacular. Highly, highly recommend it. And then one more thing I forgot to mention. My timeline filter, my output device transform, is not a color space transform. So I'm not using any color space transforms, but I am managing color spaces. I'm using a DCTL called JP2499, which is a DRT, display rendering transform. It does the same thing in application as a color space transform, but way, way, way better, because this one has just a much better tonality to it. The roll-offs are great, and then you have a little bit of control over color density. Just the way the color values are mapped is way better with JP2499. It's free. You can search that up on Google, and you can download it from GitHub. Highly recommend it as an output device transform. If you start using that instead of a color space transform, you will notice a huge difference in your clips. It pairs really well with a film look like this, like with the 2383. It just looks phenomenal. Highly, highly recommend it. totally free too, which is awesome. But yeah, that's the color. Could totally dive in. I want to make an iPhone color grading video, so stay tuned for that. And if you have any questions that you want me to answer in that video, please let me know, because this is there's so much I can talk about. But I keep saying that, but there really is. I need to actually go ahead and script it so I can take care of every single point I want to get across and showcase everything. But yeah, that was the film. Really, the only other thing outside of my workflow that I haven't talked about yet is delivery. And delivery is going to depend on where you're delivering to. For this case, I was exporting to YouTube. So my process is I set render settings that work well for YouTube, and then I export it to YouTube. Pretty simple. It's pretty fun, nothing crazy. And I have a dedicated folder on my hard drive that it goes to. I do my file management by project or by day if I'm doing like a photo trip like out to the mountains. This is by a project managed export. So it just goes to an export folder, and then I take that and put it on YouTube, and it turns out great. That's really it. That's the process of how I edited the short film. There's a million other things I could talk about, but this video would be forever long, and it probably already is forever long. So let me know if there's an area you want to see more elaboration on, or if you have any specific questions. I can try to answer that as best as I can in the comments. But if not, I would love to make a video on any specific subject that we talked about here. There's so much to dive into. It's an overwhelming amount of information that I'm trying to cram into this video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see anything else. But yes, that is the post-production process for my film, The Throne. That's going to do it for this one. I hope that what I've shared has been helpful for you. If you want to see a more detailed video on one of the sections I've gone over, please let me know in the comments, as well as any other questions you may have. And if you haven't already seen the counterpart behind the scenes video or full film, both found on my main channel, I'd highly recommend checking them out. If you enjoyed this video, you know what buttons to click. Thank you for tuning in to Resolve by Rocco.